My name is Rebecca Cole. I'm a restoration ecologist collaborating with the Crowther Lab at ETH Zurich. I'm based mainly in Costa Rica, where I carry out research on forest restoration, and I also look at patterns of forest restoration across Latin America. While there have been quite a few studies that have modeled the potential of forest restoration at a global scale, it turns out that we really don't have much information on what this looks like in reality on the ground. And my colleagues and I really felt that understanding what the people who are actually carrying out the restoration, the practitioners, are doing was very important for informing better planning, more targeted funding, and most importantly, providing effective support for these forest restoration efforts. We focus on Latin America because it's really a hotspot for forest restoration projects. The region has exceptional potential for conservation of biodiversity and capturing carbon. It also has very rapid rates of deforestation, high levels of land degradation, along with some major socioeconomic challenges in some regions. So we created a survey to ask the restoration practitioners in this region how they're approaching these challenges. And we wanted to understand what their goals and motivations are, what methods they're using, the costs involved, and how practitioners are actually measuring the success or the outcomes of these restoration projects. We got responses from international organizations, government agencies, for-profit companies, NGOs, universities, community organizations, and even quite a few private landowners. We had a ton of immediate responses from Costa Rica, also great responses from Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil, while it ended up being far more challenging to get in contact with restoration practitioners in other countries, particularly in Central America. Most of the respondents, about 55% actually, were from conservation-oriented, not-for-profit organizations. Most restoration activities were focused on lowland tropical forest, followed by montane and dry tropical forests. Practitioners expressed a whole variety of motivations for restoration, including things like improving water quality, improving food security and sustainability, and providing jobs. But by far, the two most common reasons expressed were to conserve biodiversity and to fight climate change, probably because these two issues are so closely connected with other social and economic factors. What we found out was really cool. Most practitioners are using a mix of different interventions across their projects, including some relatively new strategies like spatially patterned planting, sometimes also called applied nucleation. And this method is very effective, and it's quite a bit less expensive than traditional tree planting. So to me, this was very promising because it shows that new scientific information is being included into real-life practice. We also found that practitioners are taking a very pragmatic or practical approach when deciding how many resources to put into projects. High cost, high intensity methods are being used at a smaller scale, while less intensive low cost interventions like natural regeneration are being used more often when a project is operating at larger scales. However, we did find that tree planting is still the most commonly used method for projects, even though it's not always the most cost efficient or cost-effective approach. Because planting and growing trees is such a commonly used method for restoration, we decided to dig into how much this actually cost. And here I really want to emphasize that the objective of forest restoration through tree planting is not just to stick tree seedlings in the ground. It's to have those little seedlings survive and grow to big trees and eventually form a forest. And that outcome that we really need, which is to have trees and a forest, is a far longer process than just planting, and it can take many decades to achieve. So, using very round average numbers, what practitioners are telling us is that planting and growing one tree costs about $7 for the first 3 years, assuming that seedling survives, and then another $8.75 each over the next 10 years, totaling around $15 to $16 per tree. Another factor to take into account is the monitoring costs. So monitoring these outcomes, like tracking seedling survival and growth, and maybe some aspect of ecosystem recovery, costs an additional average of about $1,200 per hectare per year. It's important to say these costs vary hugely at the project level, but not very much across countries or regions, which surprised us. We also didn't find any evidence of efficiency of scale. So it seems likely that the local conditions, how degraded the land is at a given site, is by far the biggest factor contributing to project costs. So we found many things that were going right with restoration, but we also found some key areas that really need improvement. First, there's a big gap between the typical 1 to 3 year funding cycle and the much longer time that it takes for trees and forests to actually grow. Most organizations are trying to scale their restoration efforts up, but we found that projects that work at large scales usually involve some important trade-offs, like planting trees at lower densities and caring for them for less time. So we really need better alignment between funding timelines and the time actually needed for effective restoration. Second, while most projects monitor planted seedling survival and growth over the first few years, they rarely track biodiversity recovery, even though this is the top goal for most restoration projects. Monitoring is oftentimes too expensive for project budgets, even though it's absolutely essential information for them to know if their goals are being met or if their strategy needs to be changed. So monitoring is prohibitively expensive, and it's not being done nearly as extensively as it needs to be, and it's also not focusing on some of the most important objectives of the restoration effort. One way to help address this is to develop a more universal monitoring standard that includes metrics of biodiversity and ecosystem recovery, and to create accessible and cost-effective tools for practitioners to use to do this monitoring. Another complementary option is to integrate this type of monitoring into local jobs and livelihoods. Creating jobs and economies around restored forests so that they have local value is incredibly important to help ensure that those forests are going to be retained and not just cut down again when economic options change. I do feel very hopeful for the future of forest. There are many restoration projects going on right now, and each one is learning from experience and generating new knowledge. Not only are we getting better and more efficient at restoring at least some level of functionality to degraded lands, but there's also a recognition of the critical importance of conserving old growth forest. Both of these tasks are absolutely essential to the future of forests. One thing that stood out to me in this study is the level of dedication and commitment of so many of the practitioners leading these restoration projects. Conserving and restoring nature is incredibly hard work. But when I see the collective action of so many dedicated people, I do feel very hopeful.